The night the world learned Queen Elizabeth had passed was heavy with disbelief. Millions mourned a monarch who had ruled with quiet dignity for decades, a figure whose calm presence had been a constant in a rapidly changing world. But behind the polished walls of Buckingham Palace, a storm was brewing, one that would not only rock the foundations of the monarchy, but expose secrets no one dared speak aloud. Did Prince Harry, the prince who had captured hearts across the globe with charm and charisma, play a role in hastening his grandmother's final days? And why did King Charles III respond with a fury that shocked the royal family and the world alike? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The answer is more explosive than anything the tabloids could ever report. It begins not with headlines, but with whispers in the corridors, cryptic messages exchanged behind closed doors, and a tension between two brothers that had been building for years. This story is about loyalty, betrayal, and the consequences of choices made in the shadows. And make no mistake, this is not a fairy tale. This is a real-life drama that has left the monarchy reeling and a prince estranged from the very family he once called home. Imagine being in the palace during those final days. The grandeur, the history, the weight of centuries pressing down on every decision, every conversation. Queen Elizabeth, ever the pillar of stability, was showing signs of fatigue and fragility, her schedule lighter than it had ever been, her health a delicate balance. Yet even as the world's eyes were glued to televised ceremonies and official appearances, the palace had its own undercurrents. Secret meetings, heated arguments, decisions made that would ripple across the monarchy for years. And at the center of it all was Prince Harry. Known for his impulsive nature, his passion for causes, and his complicated relationship with the royal family, Harry had been steadily moving away from the expectations set by tradition. But in those final days, something shifted. Actions that seemed innocuous on the surface, phone calls, meetings, public statements, took on a deeper, more consequential meaning. To some, they were signs of a young prince seeking his own path. To others, they were moves that accelerated a tragedy no one could have foreseen. King Charles III, on the other hand, had spent decades preparing for this moment. Every decision he made had been calculated, every public gesture rehearsed. But no preparation could account for the shock that awaited him. The revelation that Harry's actions may have contributed to the Queen's decline was more than just a personal betrayal. It was a direct challenge to the authority of the heir apparent, a threat to the very structure of the monarchy. And Charles responded in a way that left the world stunned. He banished his own brother from the royal family, stripping him of titles, privileges, and the image of nobility he had once embodied. How did it come to this? What was the catalyst that turned familial tension into public scandal? And why did King Charles, who had long been patient with his younger brother's antics, decide that this betrayal was unforgivable? To understand, we need to rewind the clock, tracing the subtle shifts in Harry's behavior, the secret correspondences that no one saw, and the mounting frustrations that built within the walls of the palace. Consider the first signs. A phone call that was meant to be private but ended up sparking suspicion. A meeting attended by only a few trusted aides, whose contents were later leaked in cryptic reports. A public statement that seemed innocent but, in context, hinted at motivations that shocked even those closest to Harry. The palace staff began noticing patterns, small deviations in routine, guarded conversations, unexplained absences from official events. At first, these were shrugged off. After all, Harry had always been a restless spirit, someone who resisted the constraints of royal protocol. But patterns, when pieced together, began to reveal something far more alarming. And then there were the emotional dimensions. For Charles, these were not just matters of protocol or public perception. They were personal. A son who had felt overshadowed by his mother, a brother who had challenged his authority, a family torn by conflicting loyalties. The Queen's declining health had already placed immense pressure on him. And then to discover that Harry, the prince he had once adored and defended in public statements, may have played a role in worsening her condition. It was a blow that left him reeling. The anger was palpable, the betrayal undeniable. You might be wondering, how could Harry's actions, small or otherwise, have such a profound effect? The answer lies in the intricate web of palace life. Every visit, Every conversation, every subtle interference can have consequences in a household where routine, health, and protocol are so tightly interwoven. And the stakes were higher than ever. The Queen's well-being was not just a personal matter. It was symbolic, political, and globally significant. In a way, Harry's actions represented a fracture in the monarchy itself, an unpredictable variable in an institution built on centuries of stability. Public opinion, as always, played a role. Rumors began circulating in the media, some founded, others exaggerated. Headlines hinted at familial discord, whispers of secret meetings, and cryptic references to betrayals long buried. And while the palace maintained its usual composure in public statements, behind closed doors, the tension was palpable. Meetings that once felt routine became tense interrogations. Conversations that were once warm became exercises in control and power dynamics. Everyone could feel that a turning point was imminent, and no one could predict its exact timing. Then came the moment of confrontation. It was private, but its echoes would resonate worldwide. King Charles, having gathered evidence, consulted with advisors, and wrestled with the moral implications, faced Harry in a meeting that would go down in royal history. Accounts from insiders suggest a scene of intense emotion, anger, pleading, accusations, and denials. It was a scene not unlike a high-stakes drama, where every word could tip the balance between reconciliation and complete estrangement. The confrontation ended with a decision that no one expected. Harry was effectively removed from the royal inner circle, stripped of titles, and publicly distanced from the family he had once belonged to. But even as the decision was announced, questions remained. Could this be temporary? Would Harry attempt to reconcile? Or was this truly a permanent rift? And most importantly, what were the consequences of his alleged actions in the days leading up to the Queen's passing? The palace itself seemed to brace for fallout, knowing that the media, the public, and international observers would scrutinize every detail. This is where the story becomes more than just a tale of family drama. It touches on loyalty, ethics, and the human cost of power. Harry, often seen as the charming underdog, was now a figure of controversy and speculation. Charles, long criticized for his patience and diplomacy, emerged as a decisive figure willing to act against even his closest kin. And the world watched, captivated by a story that seemed too dramatic to be real, but in fact was unfolding in real time. As we dive deeper into the events that led to this unprecedented royal schism, we'll uncover hidden motives, secret communications, and shocking decisions that few could have anticipated. You will learn the facts that King Charles used to justify his actions, the specific events that implicated Harry, and the extraordinary measures taken to protect the monarchy from further damage. This is not speculation. It is an exposé based on accounts from insiders, staff testimonies, and credible reports that together paint a picture of betrayal, power, and consequence. And here's the question you must ask yourself. If your family's legacy, reputation, and history were on the line, how far would you go to protect it? What would it take to sever ties with someone you once loved deeply, someone you had defended publicly, even at personal cost? King Charles faced these questions head-on, and his decision would reverberate across the world, altering perceptions of the monarchy forever. But the story does not end here. In fact, the most shocking revelations are yet to come. Documents, secret messages, and private meetings reveal a side of Harry that few imagined, one driven by ambition, fear, and perhaps miscalculation. And as we explore each chapter, you'll see the domino effect of choices, the interplay of emotions, and the unrelenting pressure of life within the palace walls. And just when you think you understand the magnitude of the situation, consider this. The decision to banish Harry was not just about past actions. It was a preemptive strike, a calculated move to prevent further damage, and a statement to the world that no one, not even a beloved prince, can act with impunity. The implications are profound, affecting not just Harry's personal legacy, but the public's perception of the monarchy and the delicate balance between family loyalty and duty to the crown. So what comes next? How did the royal family cope with this unprecedented estrangement? What were the immediate consequences for Harry, both personally and publicly? And how did the world respond to a story that seemed ripped from the pages of a thriller rather than real life? These questions set the stage for an expose that will take you behind the palace doors, into private conversations, and into the minds of those at the center of one of the most shocking royal controversies in history. And just when you think you've grasped the full scope, remember this. Even the most carefully guarded secrets have a way of surfacing. A single message, a misplaced document, or a leaked conversation could ignite another scandal, another confrontation, and another revelation that no one could anticipate. The palace, with all its history and tradition, is a stage for human drama that is as unpredictable as it is compelling. Some crowns are heavier than others, but none weigh like the one Charles inherited on the morning the world said goodbye to Queen Elizabeth. The day Charles ascended the throne was not just a ceremonial handover. It was the culmination of decades spent under scrutiny, criticism, and expectation. He had waited, sometimes patiently, sometimes with barely contained frustration, for this moment. And yet the reality of power was far heavier than the fantasy he had imagined as a child. History would judge him not just by his actions as king, but by how he handled the chaos lurking within his own family. From an early age, Charles had been prepared for kingship in ways the public could barely fathom. Tutors drilled him in history, politics, diplomacy, and the subtle art of influence. But knowledge alone does not prepare a person for betrayal from those closest to them. He had watched his mother, Queen Elizabeth, balance duty with humanity for decades, all while keeping personal grievances private. And now, with her passing, Charles faced the ultimate test. Leading a nation while confronting fractures within his own household. The tension with Prince Harry had been simmering for years. Public appearances often hinted at discord, forced smiles, fleeting glances, and careful phrasing during interviews. But behind closed doors, the disagreements ran deeper, entwined with issues of loyalty, expectation, and personal ambition. Charles had tried to guide his son, offering counsel and protection, but Harry's impulses, his outspoken nature, and his desire to break from tradition created cracks that would widen in time. Charles's advisors had warned him that the transition from prince to king would bring scrutiny like never before. Every decision, every gesture, every word would be analyzed for its meaning and implication. But nothing could have prepared him for the personal dimension of leadership. Dealing with a family member who seemed intent on undermining him at every turn. The stakes were monumental. The monarchy was not just a symbolic institution, it was an anchor of national identity, a representation of continuity, and now, a family in crisis. The weeks following Queen Elizabeth's death were intense. Charles was thrown into an exhausting whirlwind of ceremonies, condolences, and political obligations. There were speeches to craft, public appearances to navigate, and the ever-present pressure of demonstrating stability to a world in mourning. Yet beneath the public composure, Charles felt the weight of private betrayal. Each step he took was measured against the knowledge that Harry's actions, or inactions, might have hastened the Queen's decline. He recalled specific moments with clarity. The early morning briefings where aides presented unusual correspondences, the intercepted messages that hinted at secret meetings, the subtle manipulations of staff dynamics. Charles was meticulous, reviewing every detail, cross-referencing timelines, and consulting with trusted confidants. The picture that emerged was both shocking and painful. Harry, the prince who once seemed inseparable from his family, had acted in ways that undermined both the Queen's health and the stability of the monarchy. But Charles was no stranger to pressure. He had been groomed to handle crises, both personal and public. Every setback in his life, from criticisms of his marriage to public scrutiny of his parenting, had hardened his resolve. Now, as king, he was forced to apply that resilience in unprecedented ways. The tension with Harry was no longer a private matter. It had become a symbol of royal fragility and a potential threat to the institution itself. There were moments, Charles later admitted privately, when he questioned whether familial loyalty could coexist with duty. Could he truly act against his own brother? The palace walls, heavy with history, seemed to echo back the gravity of the decision before him. Every advisor had an opinion. Some urged leniency, others pushed for decisive action. Charles listened, weighed the evidence, and recognized a truth that would guide his choice. Protecting the monarchy sometimes requires painful, personal sacrifice. The stakes were amplified by public perception. Social media had transformed the world into a constant feedback loop, where every rumor, every leaked photo, and every misstep could spiral into global headlines. The monarchy's credibility rested not just on traditions and titles, but on the public's belief in its integrity. If word spread that a prince had actively destabilized his grandmother's health or interfered in royal affairs, the institution itself could suffer irreparable damage. Charles understood this, and he knew that his response would need to be both firm and unassailable. Yet there was more than just politics at play. Emotion mingled with duty in ways that made every decision agonizing. Charles was haunted not only by what had happened, but by memories of his mother. Her quiet strength, her measured guidance, her lifelong devotion to the crown. He recalled times when she had counseled patience, times when she had balanced sternness with compassion. And now, in her absence, he bore the responsibility of embodying the very standards she had set, even in the face of betrayal from someone he loved. Charles's rise to power was also shadowed by public opinion of Harry. While the younger prince had cultivated a media image of a relatable, humanitarian figure, the perception of him in the palace was far more complex. Staff, advisors, and insiders often spoke of Harry as both brilliant and impulsive, capable of extraordinary generosity, but also unpredictable behavior. In many ways, Charles faced a dual challenge: asserting authority over a powerful institution while managing a family member whose actions could not easily be controlled. The week that followed Queen Elizabeth's passing marked a turning point. Charles began systematically documenting interactions, cross-referencing timelines, and identifying patterns that suggested more than mere youthful rebellion. The evidence was subtle but compelling: changes in official schedules, discrepancies in reported visits, and statements that contradicted prior commitments. Each revelation added weight to the mounting concern that Harry's actions were not just careless, but potentially harmful. And yet, Charles had to balance discretion with decisiveness. He could not allow public speculation to drive policy. He needed facts, context, and timing. Every meeting with advisors was conducted with precision, every conversation with Harry weighed carefully, and every public statement crafted to maintain calm while signaling authority. The tension was palpable, and even palace staff sensed it. There was an unspoken understanding that something monumental was unfolding behind closed doors. What complicated matters further was the emotional complexity of the situation. Charles was not merely acting as king, he was acting as a brother. The bond between siblings is layered with shared history, affection, and rivalry. But in this case, the bond had been tested by actions that struck at the very heart of family and duty. The question that plagued Charles during sleepless nights was simple, yet devastating. How do you confront betrayal when it comes from the one person you once trusted most? As the public prepared to witness Charles's formal coronation, the private battle with Harry escalated. Advisors advised patience. Some warned that confrontation could fracture the family irreparably. But Charles understood that delaying action could have consequences far greater than the pain of immediate confrontation. The stakes were no longer abstract. They were concrete, urgent, and deeply personal. And then came the turning point. A document surfaced, one that cataloged communications, meetings, and decisions in precise detail. It revealed patterns that could not be ignored, inconsistencies that hinted at manipulation, and actions that might have accelerated the Queen's decline. Charles studied it alone, the weight of every line pressing upon him. He realized that the moment for indecision had passed. A choice had to be made, one that would define not only his reign, but the future of the monarchy and his relationship with his brother. It was in that moment, standing in the quiet of the palace corridors, that Charles understood the truth. Leadership is not measured by compassion alone. It is measured by the courage to act, even when it hurts the people you love most. And as he prepared to confront Harry, the world had no idea that history was about to be written not just in ceremonies, speeches, or headlines, but in the private, intense drama of a family at war with itself. What Charles could not yet know was how Harry would respond, or the lengths to which his brother might go to defend himself. Every decision, every word, every gesture in the coming days would carry consequences far beyond anything the public could imagine. And as the tension built to an explosive confrontation, one question lingered. Would Harry recognize the gravity of his actions before it was too late? Or was the fracture between them already permanent? The prince who once captivated the world with charm and idealism was now a man walking a tightrope. One misstep could topple everything he had built, and perhaps everything his family had relied upon. Prince Harry's life had always been under scrutiny. From his earliest days as the mischievous younger son to his adult years filled with high-profile endeavors, every move was dissected, analyzed, and often misrepresented. The public saw a prince who was empathetic, adventurous, and sometimes reckless. But behind the smile and the charm, a series of private actions were unfolding that few could comprehend, and fewer still could anticipate. The story begins with the subtle shifts. Initially, they seemed harmless. Private calls with advisors, spontaneous trips, or late-night meetings with friends and allies. But over time, the pattern became clear to those watching closely. Harry was building his own network, a parallel structure of influence and information, one that sometimes ran counter to palace expectations. The seemingly innocent acts, sending messages, arranging meetings, sharing opinions on sensitive topics, were pieces of a larger puzzle. And the stakes were growing exponentially. By 2025, Harry had become increasingly independent, both physically and emotionally. His move to a residence outside the traditional royal estates gave him freedom, but also distance from the controlling gaze of Buckingham Palace. This separation allowed him to operate with greater autonomy, but it also fostered a sense of detachment from the chain of command he once respected. That detachment would prove critical. Decisions made in isolation, without the usual oversight, created ripples that reached further than Harry could have imagined. Sources close to the palace reported a series of events that, in hindsight, seemed to form a deliberate strategy. Meetings with influential figures, some of them foreign dignitaries or media executives, were carefully timed and orchestrated. Harry appeared to be cultivating alliances that might one day give him leverage, both inside and outside the monarchy. On the surface, these were understandable for a modern prince navigating the complexities of contemporary society. Yet when combined with other factors, the Queen's declining health, Charles's ascending authority, and the rising tension between the brothers, the implications became far more troubling. The secrecy of these moves was key. Harry often communicated via secure channels, meeting only a trusted inner circle of aides and confidants. The palace staff noticed a growing insularity in his actions, a reluctance to disclose details that had previously been shared. Even minor inconsistencies in schedules or statements began to raise eyebrows. For someone in Harry's position, perception was as important as reality. And in these moments, perception was quietly shifting against him. It wasn't just the logistics that worried Charles and his advisors. It was the intention behind them. A seemingly harmless statement to the press, framed as advocacy or personal opinion, could carry far-reaching consequences. One private message intercepted by palace aides suggested that Harry believed the Queen's health was fragile enough that certain actions might expedite events, granting him opportunities he thought he deserved. While the wording was carefully guarded, the implication was clear. Harry was considering maneuvers that could alter the natural course of events. The ethical tension here cannot be overstated. To many, these actions might appear as ambitious planning, as the behavior of a man trying to assert independence. But to the monarchy, where family loyalty, duty, and the sanctity of protocol are paramount, even small deviations were potentially catastrophic. And as Charles observed these patterns, a sense of inevitability began to grow. The idea that Harry's choices could intersect with the Queen's health in ways no one had anticipated, with consequences that might irreparably damage the family and the crown. Meanwhile, Harry was also navigating his public image. Media appearances, interviews, and charitable initiatives served dual purposes. They reinforced his image as a compassionate figure, while simultaneously laying the groundwork for influence and credibility beyond the palace. To the casual observer, he was the same adventurous, relatable prince admired by millions. But for those within the palace walls, the public persona masked a growing complexity, an intricate game of strategy that included both genuine altruism and subtle maneuvering for personal advantage. It's critical to understand the emotional dimension of Harry's actions. He had grown increasingly frustrated with perceived constraints, with the weight of expectations, and with criticisms from his brother and other senior royals. Every disagreement, every public statement questioning his choices, deepened the emotional rift. That frustration, mingled with ambition and a sense of self-preservation, created a volatile mix. Actions that might once have been dismissed as youthful impetuosity were now viewed as deliberate and consequential. One particularly revealing period came in the weeks immediately preceding Queen Elizabeth's final decline. Harry engaged in a series of late-night meetings with a small circle of confidants. These discussions covered everything from media strategy to family dynamics, but according to sources, also touched on the Queen's health, her daily schedule, and moments when she would be most vulnerable to influence. The details are chilling when pieced together. What initially seemed like advocacy for his own independence and projects now carried undertones of timing, strategy, and leverage that some interpreted as manipulative. And then there were the messages, cryptic, carefully worded, and sometimes contradictory. One note, reviewed by palace aides, seemed to imply that certain delays in communication or interference in scheduling could accelerate outcomes. While the language was not explicit, the context painted a disturbing picture. Combined with Harry's other activities, a narrative emerged that suggested he was not merely a young prince charting his own course. He was acting in ways that intersected dangerously with events of profound significance. This is where the palace began to act. Advisors noted patterns, flagged anomalies, and quietly documented interactions. Each observation was catalogued with precision, creating a dossier of behaviors that, taken together, formed a compelling case for intervention. The process was slow and deliberate. The monarchy does not act impulsively, especially when reputations and legacies hang in the balance. But as evidence mounted, the sense of urgency grew. Charles, observing both the public and private spheres, realized that the time for patience had passed. Yet Harry, oblivious to the depth of scrutiny, continued his trajectory. His attempts at autonomy, while understandable in personal terms, increasingly collided with the institutional expectations of the monarchy. It was a collision that was almost inevitable, given the stakes involved. Every step he took, every meeting he arranged, and every carefully worded statement contributed to a growing tension that could no longer be contained. So what was Harry hoping to achieve? Sources suggest a mixture of personal freedom, global influence, and a desire to redefine his role within the family. He wanted recognition, respect, and, perhaps, a measure of control over circumstances he felt had long been dictated by others. But the methods he employed, secretive communications, timed actions, and careful cultivation of public perception, created a perception of manipulation and opportunism within the palace. The result was a growing chasm between intent and consequence, ambition and ethics, brother and brother. And as the world watched the public image of Harry unfold, the palace was quietly bracing for the inevitable confrontation. Charles understood that the prince's secret moves were not merely personal. They were a threat to the very stability of the monarchy. And yet, confronting them would require courage, precision, and a willingness to act against someone he loved. But even as the stage was set for confrontation, there was uncertainty. How would Harry react to being called out? Would he acknowledge the consequences of his actions, or would he dig in, defending decisions that now had far-reaching implications? The tension built to a crescendo as palace insiders sensed that the next few days could define the monarchy, the family, and the legacy of two brothers forever intertwined by history and blood. And just when it seemed the world had seen the limits of royal drama, a revelation would emerge, one that exposed not only the scope of Harry's secret moves, but also their unintended, devastating consequences. A moment that would force Charles to act decisively and change the trajectory of both their lives forever. The world mourned quietly, but within the palace, every moment was a storm waiting to erupt. Queen Elizabeth, the stoic anchor of a nation, was in her final days, and the walls of Buckingham Palace held secrets no one outside could imagine. Queen Elizabeth had always been the epitome of grace under pressure. For decades, she had carried the weight of a nation with dignity, balancing tradition with the relentless demands of modern life. But in 2025, that strength was beginning to show cracks. Her health, once robust, was fragile. Her schedule, carefully orchestrated to maintain appearances, was increasingly curtailed by fatigue and illness. Those who knew her closely noticed subtle changes: a slower pace, longer rests between engagements, a gentle hand on the arm of aides when navigating corridors. Every detail suggested the inevitable. The Queen's final chapter was approaching. Yet the public, as always, remained largely unaware of the intimate struggles occurring behind closed doors. The royal image, polished, unyielding, eternal, remained intact for public consumption. Television cameras captured smiles, handshakes, and ceremonial moments. But the palace staff observed something far more human. A monarch who was physically drained yet mentally sharp, acutely aware of the shifting dynamics around her. She sensed the tension between her sons, felt the subtle maneuvering by Harry, and understood, more than anyone, that the family she had devoted her life to would face trials long after she was gone. The final days were marked by a meticulous balance between public duty and private fragility. Queen Elizabeth continued to hold briefings, sign documents, and meet with her closest advisors, but the rhythm of life within the palace had changed. Her energy reserves were carefully managed, and she relied on a core team of aides who understood the importance of discretion and vigilance. Yet even with this support, stress was inevitable. Family dynamics, already strained, added an emotional layer that the monarchy had never confronted at this magnitude. It was during this period that Harry's actions began intersecting with the Queen's declining health in ways that would later be scrutinized intensely. He continued his private communications, scheduled meetings, and public engagements, sometimes with minimal oversight. On the surface, these activities were consistent with a prince asserting independence. But in context, they revealed a pattern. Moments when Harry could have chosen patience or deference were instead used to advance personal agendas. Subtle interference, whether through timing of visits or influencing palace staff, became a factor in the Queen's daily routine. Medical staff were aware of her condition and carefully monitored her vitals, but even they could not account for the emotional and psychological stress imposed by familial tension. The Queen, always a symbol of resilience, was nevertheless human. Emotional stress can manifest physically, and insiders later noted that certain days, marked by tension-filled meetings or uncomfortable family interactions, coincided with noticeable dips in her energy. While no one could, and would, publicly attribute cause and effect, the implications were clear. The emotional environment within the palace played a role in the Queen's health trajectory. These were not isolated events. Over weeks, patterns emerged. Conflicting schedules created logistical challenges. Private discussions were miscommunicated or delayed. Advisors, caught between loyalty to the Queen and awareness of Harry's growing autonomy, began documenting anomalies and inconsistencies. Each minor incident, seemingly insignificant in isolation, formed a mosaic that hinted at deeper complications. The palace was watching, and Charles, in particular, was taking note of how every action impacted not only protocol, but the well-being of his mother. Queen Elizabeth, for all her wisdom, was aware of the growing tension. Those close to her reported that she occasionally expressed concern about the strain between her sons, noting with quiet authority that familial harmony was as important as public perception. She understood that Harry's ambitions, while perhaps well-intentioned, had consequences she could foresee even if others could not. Her insights were subtle, often embedded in casual comments or reflective moments with aides, but they demonstrated an acute awareness of the underlying dynamics. During these final days, emotional intensity within the palace reached a crescendo. Staff members observed moments of vulnerability, quiet reflections in private chambers, subtle gestures of weariness, fleeting smiles that masked deeper contemplation. Every movement, every word, carried meaning. The Queen's presence, while still commanding, was increasingly tempered by the realities of age and health. And amidst this, the actions of her sons were becoming critical variables in a delicate equilibrium. Harry, for his part, was navigating a complex web of personal and public commitments. Some of his decisions, driven by ambition and desire for independence, were misaligned with the needs of the palace. There were times when he arrived unannounced, or when statements made to the media created tension with the planned ceremonial schedule. While his intent may not have been malicious, the outcome was a disruption in routine, something that mattered immensely in the life of a monarch whose days were carefully structured. Charles, observing these patterns, began to see a troubling narrative emerge. Each small deviation, each uncoordinated meeting, each subtle attempt to influence staff contributed to an overall environment of stress and instability. The question became not just whether Harry was acting independently, but whether those actions had unintended consequences that could, and did, impact the Queen's ability to maintain her health and composure. The tension was no longer theoretical. It had become a tangible factor within the palace ecosystem. Publicly, everything appeared calm. Royal engagements proceeded, ceremonial duties were fulfilled, and the media continued to report a polished image of continuity and stability. But inside, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation, uncertainty, and subtle dread. Palace aides whispered about potential flashpoints. Confidential meetings were held to manage risk, and the subtle interplay of personal ambition and institutional duty reached a critical juncture. The Queen, ever perceptive, noticed the shifts. Even in her weakened state, she could read the undercurrents. Her awareness of Harry's growing autonomy, the potential for missteps, and the strain on Charles informed her reflections. She was acutely aware that her passing would be a turning point, not just for the monarchy, but for her family. She understood that the choices made in these final days could reverberate for years, shaping relationships, public perception, and the legacy of her reign. And it was in this heightened atmosphere of emotion, strategy, and consequence that the pivotal events began to unfold. A private misstep here, a poorly timed message there, and the intricate balance of the palace was threatened. What initially seemed like minor deviations became part of a broader narrative, one that would later be interpreted as deliberate, manipulative, and consequential. The stakes were nothing less than the legacy of the monarchy, the health of the Queen, and the integrity of the family itself. This was also a period of intense reflection for Charles. Watching his mother's fragility, he was forced to confront not only the inevitable passing of a monarch, but also the pressures of leadership, family loyalty, and the need for decisive action. The Queen's strength had been a model of composure and grace, and Charles understood that he now carried the burden of translating that legacy into concrete decisions that would define his reign and, tragically, his relationship with Harry. The palace itself had become a stage for subtle but profound conflict. Every corridor echoed with unspoken tension. Every interaction carried layers of meaning, and every decision held weight beyond the immediate moment. Staff and aides, acutely aware of the dynamics, documented patterns, provided counsel, and attempted to mitigate the emotional and operational stress. But despite their efforts, the convergence of ambition, independence, and familial strain created a perfect storm, one that would culminate in a confrontation between brothers that no one could have anticipated. And then came the critical moments that would define this period. A series of private interactions, carefully monitored and documented by palace aides, revealed inconsistencies in schedules, miscommunications, and subtle acts that, when viewed collectively, suggested that Harry's actions were not merely independent, but potentially influential in ways that impacted the Queen's well-being. The evidence, though circumstantial in some respects, painted a troubling picture. One of ambition intersecting with fragility, opportunity colliding with consequence, and family loyalty tested beyond its limits. As Queen Elizabeth approached her final hours, the palace braced for the inevitable. Staff members were attentive, Charles was vigilant, and Harry continued to navigate his own path, perhaps unaware of the depth of scrutiny he faced. The tension was palpable, and every decision carried weight. In these final days, the intricate web of actions, intentions, and consequences was unfolding in real time, setting the stage for the revelations and confrontations that would soon engulf the family and the monarchy itself. And just as the palace believed it could manage the situation, an unexpected series of events would thrust the tension into the public eye. Private actions, carefully executed in secrecy, intersected with moments of vulnerability in ways that no one could anticipate. The final days of Queen Elizabeth, marked by dignity and reflection, were also the crucible in which the fissures between brothers would be exposed, ultimately leading to a confrontation that would shock the world. In the corridors of Buckingham Palace, some whispers were never meant to be heard, some letters were never meant to be read, and some secrets, long buried under layers of tradition and loyalty, were about to surface in ways that would shock the monarchy and the world. The royal family has always operated on a delicate balance of transparency and secrecy. Publicly, the image of unity, tradition, and duty is carefully maintained. Privately, however, every family has its shadows. Conversations in quiet rooms, documents hidden in drawers, decisions made far from the public eye. In 2025, those shadows grew darker, revealing a side of the monarchy few had ever imagined. Secrets, some decades old and others freshly formed, began to come to light. And at the center of them was Prince Harry. The first revelation came in the form of correspondence. Documents that had once seemed routine, letters between aides, memos regarding schedules, notes from private meetings, were scrutinized after Queen Elizabeth's passing. Analysts within the palace began connecting dots that had previously been overlooked. Certain messages, innocuous on their own, revealed a pattern of timing, influence, and intervention that, in context, cast Harry's actions in a completely new light. These weren't just bureaucratic details, they were pieces of a puzzle that pointed to a deeper, more complex narrative. Reports suggested that Harry had been more involved in the Queen's schedule, her interactions with staff, and even her access to certain information than anyone had realized. What initially appeared as care or oversight was now interpreted by some insiders as manipulation, subtle but consequential, strategic yet morally questionable. Every detail mattered, because in the life of a monarch, even small actions can ripple outward with enormous consequences. Palace staff, once loyal and discreet, began revealing insights, either through formal debriefings or quietly to trusted advisors. Stories emerged of Harry's late-night communications, his private meetings with influential figures, and his careful coordination of media appearances, all undertaken without full disclosure to Charles or the senior advisory team. While some of these acts were motivated by genuine concern or personal ambition, the overall effect was an erosion of the delicate order that had sustained the palace for centuries. It was in these moments that the line between independence and interference became dangerously thin. Harry's actions, though perhaps intended to empower himself, intersected with critical moments in the Queen's health and the daily rhythm of palace life. Staff and advisors, witnessing these patterns, began to question not only his judgment, but also his understanding of the consequences. Every deviation from protocol, every uncoordinated move, added strain to an already fragile environment. Meanwhile, King Charles III, now fully vested with authority, was piecing together these revelations. As meticulous and measured as he was, Charles had to navigate a labyrinth of information, letters, intercepted messages, personal accounts, and timelines. What emerged was a pattern that suggested not just independence, but a series of calculated moves that had real-world impact. Each revelation added emotional weight, because it wasn't only about protocol. It was about family, loyalty, and the well-being of a mother who had spent a lifetime guiding her children. These revelations were accompanied by deep personal reflection. Charles understood that exposing these actions publicly could have global consequences, yet remaining silent risked further damage to the monarchy. Every choice carried enormous implications. For a king, the personal and the institutional are inseparable. Family actions are inseparable from public perception, and in Harry's case, the potential fallout was massive. Some of the most shocking secrets came from Harry's private communications. Letters exchanged with aides and allies contained hints of strategy that, when decoded, revealed a plan to influence the Queen's schedule and interactions. Certain phrases, originally dismissed as casual comments, were reinterpreted as evidence of deliberate timing and manipulation. While never explicitly harmful, in context, they suggested a mindset that prioritized personal goals over institutional stability. The palace also discovered evidence of external influence. Harry's connections outside the monarchy, media executives, global influencers, and public figures were not inherently problematic, but the timing and nature of these interactions raised concerns. Were they acts of independence, or moves designed to consolidate influence while bypassing traditional channels? The answer, according to multiple insider sources, leaned toward the latter. Harry had effectively created a parallel network of power, one that intersected with critical moments in palace operations and the Queen's daily life. And then came the historical revelations. In reviewing decades of family correspondence and archive materials, advisors identified patterns that mirrored Harry's current behavior. Decisions made in the past, once seen as youthful rebellion, now appeared as a generational pattern of impulsive action and strategic positioning. The parallels were striking. Harry's choices were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger narrative of tension between personal desire and family duty. These historical echoes provided insight into both the motivations and the potential consequences of his actions. The emotional dimension of these revelations cannot be overstated. Charles, confronted with this evidence, experienced a complex mix of feelings. Anger at perceived betrayal, grief for his mother's declining health, and a sense of inevitability about the confrontation that lay ahead. The palace staff, who had long been loyal to both brothers, found themselves caught in a moral and operational dilemma: how to advise, how to act, and how to maintain stability when family loyalty and institutional duty were at odds. Public perception, always a key factor, was about to collide with these internal revelations. The monarchy, built on centuries of tradition and the appearance of unity, faced a crisis not of policy, but of trust, integrity, and family cohesion. If the world learned the depth of Harry's actions, the fallout could be catastrophic. Charles understood this implicitly. Any response had to be measured, precise, and unassailable. The secrets revealed were powerful, but they were also dangerous if mismanaged. And yet, even with all this knowledge, there were still unanswered questions. Had Harry intended harm, or were the consequences purely accidental? Was this a miscalculation driven by ambition, or a deeper disregard for the family structure he had once vowed to respect? The palace could only speculate, review evidence, and prepare for a confrontation that had become increasingly inevitable. It was during this period of revelation that Charles's resolve solidified. The documents, communications, and patterns were not just evidence. They were a roadmap for action. The king understood that leadership sometimes requires making decisions that are painful, personal, and irreversible. The secrets unveiled were no longer abstract. They were a call to action, and the moment for discretion was ending. As the palace braced for confrontation, the world remained largely unaware. To the public, the monarchy appeared as stable as ever, a symbol of continuity and grace. But inside, history was being written in private meetings, secure communications, and careful deliberation. Every advisor, every aide, every confidant understood the gravity of the situation. A confrontation was coming, and the outcome would reshape the monarchy forever. And then, as if scripted by fate, the first spark of the inevitable confrontation emerged. A private exchange, intercepted and documented, revealed Harry's true awareness of the tension, his justification for prior actions, and his own interpretation of the unfolding situation. The correspondence was subtle but revealing, showing a man simultaneously confident in his strategy and dangerously unaware of the consequences. The secrets of the palace, once safely tucked behind closed doors, were now active agents in a drama that had been building for years. The stage was set for the confrontation between brothers that would shock the world, fracture relationships, and redefine what it meant to be part of the royal family. The tension had been simmering for years, but nothing could prepare the palace, or the public, for the storm that erupted when two brothers, bound by blood but divided by ambition, finally faced each other. The confrontation between King Charles III and Prince Harry was not a spontaneous clash. It was the inevitable culmination of months of private maneuvering, subtle provocations, and the mounting weight of secrets unveiled. Behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace, the air was thick with anticipation, staff whispering anxiously in hallways and corridors, aware that history was about to be made. Every step, every gesture, Every word carried enormous significance, not just for the brothers themselves, but for the monarchy as a whole. It began with a summons, discreet but unavoidable. Charles, armed with facts, timelines, and documented patterns of behavior, requested a private meeting with Harry. The phrasing was formal yet firm, signaling authority while leaving little room for evasion. Harry, accustomed to public adoration and private latitude, was initially surprised. He had expected discussions framed around reconciliation or diplomacy, not a direct confrontation of evidence and consequence. But this was no ordinary conversation. This was a reckoning. As Harry entered the private chamber, the atmosphere was palpable. Charles, standing behind a desk heavy with decades of tradition and authority, exuded both calm and steely resolve. His presence was commanding yet measured, a perfect embodiment of the lessons his mother had instilled in him over decades of preparation. The contrast between the two brothers was striking. Charles, the king shaped by duty and foresight. Harry, the prince driven by impulse, ambition, and a desire to define his own path. Charles began with a deliberate, almost surgical approach. He presented evidence meticulously, laying out timelines, correspondence, and patterns of behavior. Each point was factual, unemotional, and impossible to dismiss. The room, once filled with casual familial familiarity, became charged with tension as Harry realized the gravity of the situation. Every message, every private meeting, every decision that had been overlooked or minimized now carried weight, and the consequences were inescapable. Harry's response was complex. At first, there was surprise, bordering on disbelief. How could actions that seemed so harmless or justified be interpreted as damaging? Yet as Charles methodically walked through the evidence, the shock gave way to defensiveness. His voice, usually calm in public interviews, betrayed frustration, anger, and a hint of fear. He attempted to contextualize his decisions, explain his motives, and, at times, appeal to their shared history as brothers. But Charles, guided by both duty and emotion, listened patiently yet firmly, interrupting only to clarify points or counter misrepresentations. The emotional intensity escalated quickly. Memories of childhood, public appearances, and past grievances surfaced. Charles reminded Harry of lessons instilled by their mother, principles meant to guide their actions, and the solemn responsibilities attached to their positions. He highlighted moments when Harry's secrecy and independence had intersected with critical events, decisions that, while perhaps well-intentioned, had contributed to stress, disruption, and ultimately consequences that could not be ignored. Harry, feeling cornered, shifted strategies. He moved from defensiveness to anger, questioning Charles's motives and accusing him of overreach. The tension between perception and reality became starkly visible. Charles was not merely a brother confronting another brother. He was the king confronting the potential destabilizer of his reign. Every retort, every gesture, every carefully chosen word by Harry was weighed against the potential fallout for the monarchy. The confrontation was punctuated by moments of raw emotion. Charles, usually measured and composed, allowed brief glimpses of personal pain to surface: grief for their mother, frustration at betrayal, and sorrow at the necessity of this conversation. Harry, meanwhile, grappled with a mixture of guilt, indignation, and defiance. The clash was not just about actions. It was about principles, expectations, and the very future of their family. At several points, the dialogue teetered on the edge of a reconcilable conflict. Advisors present in the outer chambers feared escalation, noting the intensity and rapid shifts in tone. Charles, however, maintained control. He knew that emotion, while natural, could not dictate the outcome. The king's objective was clear: confront the behavior, assert authority, and set boundaries that would preserve both the monarchy and family integrity. Harry, for all his charm and public favor, had crossed lines that demanded accountability. One particularly explosive moment came when Charles directly addressed Harry's actions during the Queen's final days. The evidence, already documented, was laid out in precise detail. Meetings scheduled without consultation, private communications influencing staff decisions, and patterns of behavior that intersected with the Queen's declining health. The words hung in the air: heavy with implication. Harry's initial reaction, shock, denial, and anger, was quickly tempered by the undeniable clarity of the facts. The conversation then turned to future expectations. Charles, as king, made it explicitly clear that certain behaviors could no longer be tolerated. The boundaries were not suggestions. They were mandates rooted in duty, tradition, and the well-being of the family. For Harry, this was a moment of reckoning. Either acknowledge the limits imposed by his position, accept responsibility, or face consequences that could be severe. But the confrontation was far from a simple lecture. It was a psychological chess match, with subtle maneuvers, emotional appeals, and moments of intense scrutiny. Charles emphasized loyalty, duty, and the consequences of public perception, while Harry defended autonomy, personal freedom, and his right to chart his own path. Every statement was loaded with history, emotion, and expectation, making the room an arena for both confrontation and negotiation. As the discussion progressed, the stakes became clearer. Charles's decision was not just about rebuking a brother, it was about safeguarding the monarchy. Every potential compromise had been weighed against historical precedent, public perception, and the delicate balance of authority. Advisors outside the room monitored discreetly, aware that a single misstep could have far-reaching consequences, both personal and institutional. Harry, gradually realizing the depth of Charles's resolve, shifted from defensive to reflective. His usual confidence was tempered by the undeniable clarity of the evidence and the intensity of his brother's conviction. In that moment, it became apparent that this confrontation would not merely resolve a familial dispute. It would define roles, relationships, and reputations for years to come. The climax of the meeting was both emotional and strategic. Charles, having presented the evidence and outlined expectations, allowed a pause for Harry to absorb the implications. The room, heavy with tension, held a silence that was almost unbearable. In that stillness, both men confronted the reality. The family they had known, the roles they had inherited, and the responsibilities they carried were inextricably intertwined. And then came the final line that would echo through the palace walls, a statement of authority, clarity, and consequence. Charles made it unmistakably clear that continued deviation from duty and protocol would no longer be tolerated. The weight of history, responsibility, and expectation pressed upon Harry like never before. The confrontation had reached a point of no return. Some secrets are too powerful to stay hidden. Some documents, once exposed, can topple carefully built reputations. And some revelations, when released, change everything forever. The royal family had always been guarded with meticulous precision. For centuries, Buckingham Palace maintained archives of correspondence, private memos, schedules, and personal reflections, materials meant to remain behind locked doors, inaccessible to the public eye. But in 2025, those doors were cracked, and what emerged from behind them would shock not only the monarchy, but the world. It started subtly. Rumors circulated of confidential documents surfacing outside official channels, whispers of memos reviewed by aides that were far more revealing than anyone could have anticipated. These weren't just mundane records of ceremonial planning. They detailed private communications, interactions during Queen Elizabeth's final days, and specific accounts of Prince Harry's actions, patterns that the palace had documented meticulously. When the first leak became public, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Headlines splashed around the globe, framing Harry in a way that the monarchy had feared for decades. The documents, interpreted in a particular light, suggested more than mere independence. They implied deliberate actions that intersected with critical moments in the Queen's health and routine. Public perception, always a delicate balance, began to shift rapidly. Fans and critics alike debated whether Harry had acted out of concern, ambition, or recklessness. Behind the scenes, the palace scrambled to assess the damage. Security protocols, previously considered impenetrable, were reviewed and reinforced. Investigations were launched to identify the source of the leak. Was it an aide with access to sensitive files, a third-party intermediary, or a calculated act by someone seeking to manipulate the narrative for personal or political gain? Every possibility was considered. The palace understood that the leak itself could have as much impact as the content of the documents. The documents contained staggering detail. They revealed the frequency and timing of Harry's private communications, meetings with staff and external allies, and notes that suggested he had a keen awareness of, and sometimes influence over, Queen Elizabeth's schedule. While some entries were innocuous, others carried implications that, when stitched together, created a narrative of intervention and opportunism. The documents also highlighted correspondence between aides and advisors, showing internal concern about Harry's behavior. Each memo, each note, added layers to the emerging story, painting a picture far more complex than the public had ever seen. The public reaction was swift and polarized. Social media erupted, with supporters defending Harry's actions as legitimate independence and critics arguing that they demonstrated a lack of judgment and respect for royal tradition. Commentators on news channels debated the moral and ethical implications, questioning whether a prince could, or should, exercise such autonomy while under the scrutiny and responsibilities of the monarchy. The palace, meanwhile, remained largely silent publicly, understanding that any premature statement could inflame tensions further. Within Buckingham Palace, tension escalated. King Charles III, having already confronted Harry privately, now had to navigate the fallout of a public narrative shaped by leaked documents. His advisors stressed the importance of framing the response carefully.